The last session of your course is going to be dealing with property management and what the broker's role is in property management. To begin with, property management became very, very popular a number of years ago, basically because of absentee ownership. And let me explain absentee ownership. These are people that own properties here in Florida that don't live here. They bought them as an investment or a second home. Somebody has to manage those, and if they're not here to manage, somebody else has to. And there are a number of areas of property management, but let's talk about the property management market itself. You have office building management, residential management, retail management, and I've got to tell you that community association management is an important issue. Here in Florida, we have a lot of condominiums and associations that we have to deal with. Who is that person that has to have a CAM license? Anytime that the association has more than 10 units, and by the way, it doesn't have to be in the same facility. It can be spread out. Or their budget is more than $100,000 a year. Once again, it doesn't have to be in the same facility. A CAM license is then required. The rental process, you got to evaluate your tenants. You got to look at a number of things. And let me say this, when you evaluate the property or the property analysis, you're looking at the interior, the exterior. You're trying to determine if it's in a good location. And what I'm speaking of right now is that if I'm a property manager and I want to take on a new property management facility, an apartment building, whatever it is, I got to make sure that this is the kind of building that I can manage properly. So there's a lot of things that I want to analyze in the process. And when we're looking at trying to market that product, I'm going to tell you now, one of the things that a lot of brokers try to do in marketing is they have to key in on, is this building unique? Is there some architectural features about it that make it unique that we can use as a marketing technique? We call that thematic images. In other words, the building has a theme to it. Brokers also have to understand tenant policies. Now let's talk about the various kinds of leases. The ground lease. A ground lease is where we're basically renting dirt. A lot of your shopping centers, the developer has a lot of excess land left over. Instead of selling that land, what they're going to do is lease the land. A net lease is where the tenant pays rent plus pays part of the operating expenses. A percentage lease is where the tenant not only pays rent and maybe some of the operating expenses, but a lot of their rent is going to be based on their gross revenues. In other words, there's a percentage of their gross revenues that will be contributed to the lease as well. And I tell you, a lot of your shopping centers do that. You give the tenant a low lease amount up front or a base lease up front and simply take it off the revenues as they grow. The various types of leases that we have available, the tenancy for years. The tenancy for years is a true lease that is hard to break. It's hard to terminate. In a tenancy for years, you have a beginning date, you have an ending date, and it has to be in writing. Those components have to be there. And the only way that that can be terminated is somebody breaches ahead of time. Otherwise, that's in full force. And let me say this, if the property sells and there's a tenancy for years in place, that tenant doesn't have to worry about being terminated. They don't have to worry about being evicted. They can stay in that property until their lease expires. A tenancy at will is missing one of those components. Could be anything. A tenancy at will could be a month-to-month renter, which means that we have a beginning date, but we don't have an ending date. And it could be either oral or in writing. It doesn't matter. If we're dealing with a month-to-month tenant, if we're dealing with that month-to-month renter, remember that eviction can be done or termination can be done with at least a 15-day notice, whereas the tenancy for years can't be. Also, there is a tenant at sufferance. What would you need to understand about a tenant at sufferance? This is simply a holdover, and their relationship can be terminated fairly easily. The owner-management relationships typically have to do with the owner and the broker who's managing it, understanding each other's needs. And I think that if you're going to manage a company, you need to know who that owner is. What are their assets? What are their liabilities? And there's obviously needs to be some kind of a contract with them. One of the important issues that we always have to talk about when we talk about property management is the Residential Landlord Tenant Act. Now, I want to say that the Florida Residential Landlord Tenant Act is different than the non-Residential Landlord Tenant Act. Different components. The Residential Landlord Tenant Act is supposed to make sure that both the landlord and tenant are treated equally. And some of the important issues about this has to do with deposits. And I think the important issues here is that landlords can treat security deposits a little different than brokers. And I think one of the big things is that when they put it in an interest-bearing account, they have to be able and be prepared to pay their tenant at least 5% interest earned or 75% of what was actually collected. And again, that's going to be a landlord choice. That landlord can also commingle those funds into personal accounts. Now, if they do this, there's a lot more to it. They're first going to owe their tenant 5% interest for the use of their money. But more importantly, they're going to have to post a surety bond, which is an insurance policy, with a clerk of courts in the amount of the deposit, as long as those deposits don't exceed $50,000. Now, when a lease terminates, the question might be, was there damage to the property? And if the landlord intends to retain any of the security deposit for damage, they've got to notify their tenant within 30 days by certified mail to the last known address of their intentions to retain either some or all of that deposit. If they fail to do this, they've given up any right to any portion of that deposit. And also, when you're talking about a breach of a lease, the first thing that a landlord's got to do is to give them a 3-day notice. If you don't make your payment, you've got 3 days to make it up. And if you don't, then I can start the eviction process. And what the landlord is looking for is a writ of possession. That's issued by a judge. Staffing and employment, I think that hiring property managers are going to be important. In terms of a license, just remember that individuals that are managing an apartment building where they're on a salary and not working for a broker, as long as they're on a salary only or exempt. Also managers of condominiums where they're on a salary basis, and as long as these leases don't exceed a year, these are exempt as well. When you're working for a broker, you're not going to be exempt. Rental list. Let me tell you about rental list and what rental lists are all about. Brokers have the capacity to sell rental information list. And what brokers do in some areas, they collect rental properties, put them on a list, and they cut a deal with the owner of the property. And they say, I tell you what I'll do. If I can find you a tenant, will you give that tenant a break on first month's rent? Will you give them $300 off? Or whatever it might be. If the owner of the property says, yes, I'll do it, then that broker is going to take that list and sell it to a potential tenant for $300. And the deal is this. When you rent one of my properties, you're going to get your money back in the reduction of your first month's rent. Now here's the deal. If you choose not to rent, I'll give you back 75% of what you paid for the list. And here's the other side of it. If that list is inaccurate materially, I'm willing to give you back 100% of what you paid for that list. It's all contractual. Now here's the deal. If there's going to be a refund, the tenant or the potential tenant has to make that demand within 30 days of buying that rental list. The rental information list, by the way, if the broker violates that, it's a first-degree misdemeanor, which carries, again, a penalty of up to 1 year in a county jail and or up to a $1,000 fine. And that's all we have for this session. And what I'd like to do now is I'd like to review with you the material that are those areas of critical concern. Property management has become popular because of absentee ownership. The CAM license is required if there's more than 10 units or the budget is more than $100,000 in any association or combination of associations. A percentage lease applies to leases that require rental payments plus a percentage of the gross revenues. A tenancy for years is a lease that has a beginning date and ending date and has to be in writing. The landlord can commingle deposits in personal accounts but must pay the tenant 5% interest and post a surety bond with the clerk of courts. If the landlord wishes to retain the security deposit or any portion of it, they have to notify their tenant by certified mail within 30 days of termination of their intent. If the rental information list is accurate, the broker has to be prepared to pay back 75% of what was paid for it. If the rental information is inaccurate, the broker has to be prepared to pay back 100% of what was paid for the list. In both cases, the potential tenant has to make the demand within 30 days of making that demand. Violation of rental information laws is a first-degree misdemeanor and can carry a penalty of up to 1 year in the jail and or up to a $1,000 fine. And that's all I have for this session.